Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Jeffrey Smith, a psychiatrist and therapist, and we at howtherapyworks.com want to make psychotherapy more accessible, easier to teach and to learn. The title of this video is A Modern Conceptual Framework Eases Training and Sharpens Practice. Our field, psychotherapy, was born at the height of the Victorian era. There was no science then to explain the healing moments, but one individual wrote what I believe was the first description of clinical memory reconsolidation. Sigmund Freud described how the dramatic emergence of previously dissociated traumatic memories led to rapid and permanent healing of horrifying trauma. Memory reconsolidation has two requirements, and Freud grasped very well the first of the two, the need to make the unconscious conscious with affect. However, he missed the second requirement. As a Victorian scientist, he saw himself as an objective observer and, as one might expect, failed to mention the equally important element of nonverbal information conveyed by his own calm, empathic presence. That new information was what transformed the patient's unspeakable horror into no more than a sad memory. But our field has a problem. No one understood at that time how the brain worked, so Freud and others after him had no choice but to invent explanations for what they saw. To this day, one founder's conjecture is as good as another's, which greatly complicates both learning and practice. In the year 2000, though, elucidation of the change mechanism of memory reconsolidation was the last puzzle piece needed to complete the missing trunk and roots of our field. My aim today is to describe the infrastructure that applies to all therapies in a way that makes it easier to teach and more accessible for daily practice. I'll be taking the somewhat unusual point of view of the flow of information. When I've mentioned information in the past, some people thought I was excluding emotion. Not at all. Eric Kandel, the Nobel Prize winner, showed that groups of neurons that fire together can capture an unlimited range of types of information, far beyond prosaic words. My favorite definition of the information the mind can store and process is anything that can be described in poetry. Broadening our repertoire to embrace that variety is what makes psychotherapy an art. Now, to build a science-based framework, we're going to need a single definition of what psychotherapies aim to treat. Currently, every therapy has its own ideas, and they're not compatible with one another. That makes it very difficult to find out what they have in common. So let's let the science of evolution be our guide. Over time, mammalian central nervous systems have become ever more complex to cope better with changing environments. From this point of view, our brains are information processing organs evolved to take in large amounts of data from outside and inside. They then continuously process that information to identify opportunities and threats, and to calculate strategies that will increase the odds of survival and procreation. In humans, our complex social structures and slow development create special challenges and, not surprisingly, more opportunities for what we might call coping gone awry. And that is what psychotherapy aims to change. To be a bit more precise, a group of us at SEPI, the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration, looked at the mind's problematic responses and came up with the term entrenched maladaptive patterns, EMPs for short. That term describes responses that are resistant to change, dysfunctional, and liable to be repeated. Those are the subunits of pathology that all psychotherapies are designed to treat. As you can see, the range of problems is vast, as is the suffering they cause. Many of them are influenced by biology, but the parts that therapy seeks to change are the parts that are the result of the mind's calculations about what is best for survival. Having a universal definition of what we're aiming to change, we can now look at how the mind's automatic and largely unconscious protective system works. Here's a functional diagram. Information about the current state of the outer and inner environments is gathered and processed. In the fear system, where much of the research has been done, the final appraisals take place in the amygdala, a component of the limbic system. As I see it, in that final stage, 3 critical factors are weighed and analyzed. 1, will the threat impact survival or procreation? 2, what is the best strategy to deal with the threat? And 3, do we have enough power and resources for the strategy to succeed? If not, it's back to the drawing board. Based on those factors, the amygdala sends out a signal, a specific call to action transmitted to other limbic structures to initiate the selected protective strategy. That signal is hugely important because if we can change the signal, we'll change the response, and that's what therapy wants to do. It has 2 faces, a scientific one and a clinical one. Neurophysiologists think of the signal as the firing of a small number of neurons. On the other hand, we clinicians can think of it as unconscious emotion. That is the necessary link between inputs and the mind's output of responses. And yes, there is good scientific evidence to show that unconscious emotion exists. Unlike other constructs in the field of psychotherapy, unconscious emotion is real. It can be measured with electrodes and scanners in the laboratory. No one knows exactly what an unconscious emotion feels like. But even without lab equipment, we clinicians have indirect ways to learn about it. We do that by observing the elements that make up the mind's responses, as shown on the right in the mirror of consciousness. The quickest to appear, and among the most reliable of those indicators of unconscious emotion, is affect. That is, bodily changes such as tears or changes in breathing. Other components of the response are also important. Spontaneous thoughts and impulses can tell about the unconscious emotion that triggered them. Conscious feelings are generally more highly elaborated reflections of unconscious emotion. And finally, it often happens that a verbal description either resonates or does not, giving yet another window on the specifics of unconscious emotion and the protective strategy it embodies. We want to change the unconscious emotion because it is responsible for the specific entrenched maladaptive pattern, EMP, we want to change. But we can't, because unconscious emotion is automatic and determined by the logic that evaluated those 3 factors I mentioned before. 1, the seriousness of the threat. 2, the chosen strategy. And 3, our ability to carry it out. Instead, we'll have to change the previous layer of logic. Like the programming in a computer and like the other information held in the brain, that logic is stored in memory. In this case, it's called procedural memory, similar to the kind that tells us how to drink from a glass or to form grammatically correct sentences. How might we do that? Well, once again, science comes to the rescue. There is only one known way to rewrite that logic, and it is the well-researched change mechanism of memory reconsolidation. Here is a slide with 3 pioneers in the field. Karim Nader is credited with having first elucidated the neurophysiology of memory reconsolidation. Bruce Ecker, a clinician in New York City, was one of the first to recognize the importance of memory reconsolidation in all kinds of therapies. And Richard Lane, a friend at the University of Arizona, has written extensively on how memory reconsolidation is relevant to major therapies in practice today. For completeness, there are two other change mechanisms relevant to psychotherapy. One is classical learning by repetition, which is involved when patients learn new and unfamiliar response patterns, which are then added to the patient's repertoire of possible responses. The other, extinction, was first observed by Pavlov but has the disadvantage of being only temporary. I'm going to leave those two aside from here on because memory reconsolidation is the only one that can produce dramatic healing moments like the ones Freud and Breuer described in 1893. As I suggested earlier, this amazing change mechanism has just two primary requirements. Let's look at them one at a time in a bit more detail. The first requirement is to set the old response pattern into a neurologically active state. This is the one Freud described, and it is one place where science validates existing therapeutic techniques by showing why they are needed. Now I want each of you to think of your favorite technique for bringing affect into the room. Here are some ways different therapies do it. Verbal exploration, free associations, and examination of automatic thoughts can do it. The relationship and transference are powerful ways to awaken old responses. Exposure therapy aims explicitly to awaken conscious feelings, which are themselves indirect indicators of unconscious emotion. Experiential therapies use techniques like empty chair exercises. More recently, the importance of bodily movement has been recognized. And one of the most powerful and perhaps the least acknowledged is voluntary behavior change, which often leads to profound emotional activation. Not only does the science validate these techniques that are part of every therapy, but by focusing purposefully on awakening relevant affects, we have an opportunity to sharpen our practice. I'll give some thoughts at the end about a simple but sophisticated way to teach this. The second requirement for memory reconsolidation is simultaneously to bring in a new perspective, new information that contradicts the old logic. I like to call it an antidote. As the new information collides with the old, it causes what neurophysiologists call prediction error, which then initiates a 5-hour period during which the old logic held in limbic procedural memory can be rewritten. Every therapy has its own ways to impart new disconfirming information. Much of this is nonverbal, and as in Freud's catharsis, it may not be made explicit in descriptions of the technique. Here again, I would like you to think of the techniques you use in your own practice to bring new disconfirming information, verbal and nonverbal, to your patients. Since Freud's original observations, many therapies have recognized healing moments where both of the requirements for memory reconsolidation are met. Perhaps the second oldest way to supply disconfirming information is interpretation. CBT therapists do something similar when they correct irrational beliefs. The potential problem with these communications is that they can also promote intellectualization. The science now shows why that's a problem. When patients go into an intellectual mode, affect is extinguished, unconscious emotion is deactivated, and the conditions for memory reconsolidation are no longer met. Other descriptions include Alexander and French's corrective emotional experience, in which the patient's emotionally charged expectations are contradicted by experience within the therapeutic relationship. The Boston Change Process Study Group identifies moments of meeting, times when new understanding comes serendipitously and may be pivotal to the therapy. Unfortunately, these moments are seen as taking place by chance, events we must wait for if they are to happen at all. Other techniques are more purposeful. Clinical mentalization and mindfulness, for example, capture the collision between self-involved emotional experiences and a larger outside perspective. Once again, gaining a clear picture of events going on in limbic structures can sharpen our technique by inviting us to be more focused and thoughtful about how we convey new information that forms an antidote. That leads to a third requirement that is less obvious but embodies the art of psychotherapy. We need to remember that we are communicating with a part of the mind that processes information, that is, anything that can be described in poetry, in its own way. The associative logic used there works differently from formal logic. Here's an example. Recently, a patient shared the specifics of her childhood abuse that had caused her a great deal of shame. She was worried and wondered if I was so disgusted that I would want to throw her out of treatment. Later, she told me it was not my verbal denial, but the involuntary body language as I spoke that told her that the thought of discharging her had not even entered my mind. What this means for us is that we need to pay close attention to our patients' communications and engage our own limbic system and its intuitive thinking as we interact with our patients. As I promised, I'll offer one final takeaway that can help with both teaching and practice. Common factors set the table, while memory reconsolidation is the meal. A practice that fulfills requirements for both is continuously to seek what Carl Rogers called accurate empathy. That term encapsulates an attitude of curiosity, aiming for an ever more detailed, clear, and emotionally sensitive understanding of each of those EMPs, those subunits of pathology that are behind the patient's suffering and are what we want to change. In our therapy coaching program, we have developed a simple but sophisticated way to do this by pursuing 5 questions about each EMP, starting with the most accessible or easiest to change. Working with the patient to pursue a deeper understanding helps build the alliance, while curiosity about the specifics leads to fulfillment of those 2 requirements for memory reconsolidation, namely activating the old pattern and providing the disconfirming antidote. In this way, seeking accurate empathy through these 5 questions is a simple formula for ultimately rewriting the logic behind the patient's EMPs. And that leads to change in the unconscious emotion, which then in turn shapes a more satisfactory response. And that is the central aim of psychotherapy. Thank you for watching, and I hope we'll see you at howtherapyworks.com, where we have many more resources and ways to help you with teaching, with learning, and with practicing psychotherapy, and also for the sophisticated consumer to understand what's going on in your therapy. So again, thank you, and bye for now.